Theology is a science that requires a very broad scope of knowledge in order to be complete. Often it requires one to partake in special studies in various matters of history, linguistics, philosophy, and much more. At times it can be quite overwhelming. As the great Thomist Francisco de Vitoria said, quote, "The office and function of the theologian is so extensive that no argument, no dispute, no place seems foreign to the theological profession and institution," end quote. Due to this fact, there are many men who lazily jump into theologizing and writing with only the basics, or even without these, attempting to overextend their hand into areas where they are simply incompetent. It is easy for individuals to come into complicated topics while completely ignorant of the background, context, or even content of the text they cite. These individuals, quite common on the internet, seem to have never read the text they quote, but simply gathers them from quote mines. This is easy to see from a topic like the various different comparisons of Thomism and the Church Fathers. For example, do you think it is a coincidence that everyone talking about this issue just so happens to quote the same exact passage from St. Cyril as this 2009 J. Dyer comment? Often, many of these individuals do not even bother to flip to the next page of the works they are citing. For example, it is quite common to quote the passage from St. Gregory Nazianzus' Third Theological Oration, where he says, quote, "Are immortality and innocence and immutability also the essence of God? If so, God has many essences and not one, or deity is a compound of these. For he cannot be all these without composition, if they be essences," end quote. Yet these individuals do not flip to the next page and read what St. Gregory says below as to why these attributes are not multiple essences. St. Gregory on literally the next page states, quote, "Our position, however, is that as in the case of a horse or an ox or a man, the same definition applies to all the individuals of the same species, and whatever shares the definition also has a right to the name. So in the very same way, there is one essence of God, and one nature, and one name. Although in accordance with a distinction in our thoughts, we use distinct names, and that whatever is properly called by this name really is God, and what he is in nature, that he is truly called, if at least we are to hold that truth is a matter not of names, but of realities," end quote. Far from refuting the Thomistic position, this text from St. Gregory actually refutes the position that posits a real distinction between the attributes. St. Gregory, in the original quote, denies that the, quote, "deity is a compound of these." What is a composite, and how does composition occur? For any one of the ancients, a composite is the union of that which is really distinct. This is exactly what many of these individuals believe about the distinction between the essence and the energies. But this brings us to a deeper question about reading these fathers. What is actually being communicated by them when they seemingly go back and forth, sometimes declaring the lack of identity between the attributes, and at other times declaring their difference to be merely of name? What is going on here? To understand what the Church Fathers are really saying about divine simplicity, we must first master the philosophical vocabulary they inherited from Aristotle and his commentators. Without this foundation, their arguments appear contradictory, when they are actually perfectly consistent. It is actually quite simple for anyone who is familiar with the Aristotelian tradition to bring together these supposedly contrary statements. While these authors, of course, refuted those who attempted to place Aristotle above divine revelation, it is true that they received a great deal of their philosophical training, like many of the medievals, in hearing lectures and commentaries on the works of Aristotle. Especially influential among the Cappadocians was Porphyry, as it was true of St. John of Damascus with Ammonius. The language of things like property or essence or specific difference or synonym or homonym are all taken directly from those peripatetic commentators on Aristotle and are employed in a technical sense. Interestingly, we will see that St. Thomas Aquinas, the common doctor of the Catholic Church, is going to use such terms in the same exact way when explaining divine simplicity. Here there are two important places to go to understand what they mean by the concepts they are employing against the Eunomians. First, the categories of Aristotle, especially the first antipredicamental. Second, the isagogy of Porphyry and the topics of Aristotle, especially what is said about the predicables. It is important to note that both of these works, in the ancient mind, were concerned with naming and only secondarily concerned with distinctions in reality. This will become important in interpreting these authors. Porphyry himself makes this priority clear when he states that the inquiry is, quote, "primarily about significant expressions, rather than real distinctions in being. This becomes evident in Porphyry's commentary on the categories, where he writes, quote, "Our inquiry is incidentally concerned with generic differentiae of beings, while primarily it is about significant expressions." End quote. What is most important for our purpose is what is said at the beginning, where Aristotle writes, quote, "Things are said to be named equivocally or as a homonym, when though they have a common name, the definition corresponding with the name differs for each. On the other hand, things are said to be named univocally or as a synonym, which have both the name and the definition answering to the name in common. Not only the name, but also the definition is the same in both cases. Things are said to be named derivatively or as a paronym, when they derive their name from some other name, but differ from it in termination." End quote. Notice how I've included both the Greek terms that the Cappadocians would have learned and the Latin terms that St. Thomas would have used from St. Boethius' translation. This is crucial because when the medieval uses the term ratio when treating the names of God, the Cappadocians uses the corresponding term logos. They're speaking the same philosophical language, just in different tongues. So we have three categories so far, which I will use the Greek names for. First, the homonym, which have a common name, but the ratio or logos of the name differs. For example, a white man in James White. In the first case, it is a color. In the second case, it is a last name. Second, the synonym, which have a common name and the ratio or logos of the name are the same. For example, I use the term man as a synonym when I refer to Adam and John as men. Third, the paronym, when one name is derived from the other name. This will not be important for our study, so I will not go into detail. But here's where it gets interesting for our purposes. By the time of the Cappadocians, there was an additional category that becomes absolutely crucial for understanding their arguments about divine simplicity. Quote, "Polyonyms are things that have several different names, but one and the same account, such as sword, saber, and blade. The thing in question is one, as is the definition that corresponds to the name, but the names sword, saber, and blade are different." End quote. These polyonyms refer to a multitude of different words that have the same definition. In English, we usually refer to these as synonyms, which is not the case among the Greeks. In Greek, a synonym has the same name and same definition, whereas in English, a synonym is actually a polynym, since it has different names but the same definition. Further, besides the homonym, synonym, paronym, and polyonyms, there are also heteronyms, which simply refer to two things and do not share the same name or definition. With this philosophical toolkit in hand, understanding the difference between homonyms, synonyms, and especially polyonyms, we can now see what the fathers were arguing against and why their position aligns perfectly with St. Thomas's. The Eunomian heresy reduced all of God's attributes to mere polyonyms, different words with identical meanings. Understanding this error is essential to grasping why both the Cappadocians and St. Thomas respond in identical ways to the Eunomian error. For Eunomius, the attributes of God were simply distinct names with the same exact definition, that is, with the same ratio or logos, which would make them polyonyms. In other words, saying God is good or wise or powerful would be like saying sword or saber, just different words for exactly the same concept. Was this a position of St. Thomas? No, of course not. St. Thomas clearly says that the ratio of one attribute and another attribute are distinct from one another. They are not merely distinct as to name. This is affirmed in a number of different places. Remember, the terms that St. Thomas is using are the exact same as the Cappadocians due to their common source in the peripatetic tradition. These are technical terms with technical meanings. It is easy to see their unity of sense. St. Thomas writes, quote, "These names spoken of God are not synonymous, since they have different rationes." End quote. On the screen, I added the Greek terms that underlies the Latin translation by St. Boethius that St. Thomas was following. Notice St. Thomas is saying word for word exactly what Eunomius is denying and what St. Basil affirmed. In fact, if you compare the first book against Eunomius by St. Basil and St. Thomas's commentary in the first book of Sentences, Distinction 2, Question 1, Article 2 and 3, the similarities between St. Thomas's and St. Basil's arguments are striking. Let's look at Eunomius's actual position to see what the fathers were fighting against. Quote, "When we say unbegotten, we do not intend to honor God in name alone by human conceptualization. Rather, we intend to repay him the most necessary debt of all, namely confessing that he is what he is. Things said by way of conceptualization have an existence in name alone, and by nature are dissolved together with the sounds used to say them." End quote. Clearly, as we will see soon, The Eunomian position is not that of St. Thomas's, since St. Thomas does not think that the meaning of each of the names is identical. He denies that the names are polynyms explicitly, which is how St. Basil will refute Eunomius. In summary, Eunomius claimed our concepts about God are mere polynyms or synonyms. Both St. Basil and St. Thomas rejected this position, affirming instead that our concepts have real foundation in God, while maintaining genuine conceptual distinctions. Therefore, they are not able to maintain both that the names of God are not mere synonyms and that there is not real distinction in God. As we will see, St. Basil's refutation of Eunomius provides the clearest evidence that the Cappadocian understanding of divine simplicity is identical to that of St. Thomas Aquinas. Both affirm one simple divine reality, known through genuinely distinct concepts. In his refutation of Eunomius, he does not affirm some sort of real distinction in composition in God, but affirms that the divine attributes are conceptually distinct, yet not synonymous, just like St. Thomas Aquinas does. First, St. Basil addresses the fundamental question of what conceptualization actually means. He refutes the Eunomian idea that our concepts are mere mental fictions, in language remarkably similar to St. Thomas's treatment of the idea of a remote foundation of the names of God, which were the positions of Avicenna and Maimonides. St. Basil writes, quote, "What in the world is a conceptualization? Does this name signify absolutely nothing, being merely a noise escaping from the tongue? But such a thing is not called conceptualization, but rather craziness and babbling. Now, what if Eunomius were to concede that a conceptualization does in fact signify something, but something completely false and non-existent, like the fictional centaurs or chimera?" End quote. Compare this to St. Thomas's parallel argument against those who deny any proximate foundation for the divine names. Quote, "What is signified through the name has neither a proximate nor a remote foundation in the reality, such as the conception of a chimera. For it is neither the likeness of any reality outside the soul, nor does it follow from the mode of truly understanding any reality, and thus such a conception is false." End quote. After establishing that our concepts have a real foundation in God, St. Basil explains how conceptualization actually works, from which we form the divine names. This is crucial for understanding his position on divine simplicity. Quote, "It still remains to demonstrate not only how and for what sort of realities customary usage of language employs the term conceptualization, whatever seems simple and singular upon a general survey by the mind, but which appears complex and plural upon detailed scrutiny, and therefore is divided by the mind. This sort of thing is said to be divided through conceptualization alone. For example, the concept of grain exists in everyone as something simple, but when we examine grain in detail, we come to consider more things about it and use different designations. For the same grain can be called at one time fruit, at another time seed, and at another time nourishment. Generally speaking, all things recognized through sense perception, and which seem simple in substrate, but which admit of a complex account upon further consideration, are said to be considered through conceptualization." End quote. Notice what St. Basil establishes here. Something can be simple in reality, that is, simple in substrate, while admitting multiple true concepts or definition, that is, complex account. This is exactly St. Thomas's position. The denial of Eunomius only requires a complexity of account, which is multiplicity of logos, or in Latin, ratio. St. Thomas affirms the same principle when he writes, quote, "The conceptions that our intellect conceives from the names of the attributes are truly likenesses of the reality that is God, although they are deficient and not full, just as is the case for other realities that are like God, whence such rationes are not merely in the intellect, since they have their proximate foundation in the reality that is God. And from this it arises that whatever follows upon wisdom as such, rightly and properly speaking, belongs to God." End quote. Later in the same book, we come to the absolutely crucial passage where St. Basil explicitly denies that God's attributes are polynyms. Quote, "The usage of conceptualization that we have learned from the divine word is actually quite close to the way of using the term that we have outlined above. He is not a polynym. All these names do not carry the same meaning as one another, for light signifies one thing, vine another, way another, and shepherd yet another. Although our Lord is one in substance, and one substance simple and not composite, he calls himself by different names at different times, using designations that differ from one another for the different conceptualizations." End quote. If we are careful to consider what is said here, this completely destroys the opponents of St. Thomas. What St. Basil has denied here is that the attributes are polynyms. What does this even mean? This means that St. Basil affirms that, while they are the same in reality, they are distinct in the ratio, which is the exact formulation that St. Thomas follows. Quote, although the names applied to God signify one reality, still because they signify that under many and different aspects, they are not synonymous. End quote. The connection St. Basil makes between these distinct concepts in God's energies or operations is also significant. He explains that God employs different names, quote, on the basis of his different energies and his relation to the objects of his different benefaction, end quote. This is precisely what the medieval scholastics called an attribute with a remote foundation in causality. St. Thomas states the same principle. Quote, it is done through the mode of causality in two ways, either insofar as he produces such things in what is created, such that God is called good because he pours goodness into created things, or insofar as he relates to us according to the mode of a created thing, end quote. Far from justifying some real distinction between essence and energies, the comment made about energies actually bolsters the position of St. Thomas. The energies spoken of are very clearly said to be distinct in the same exact way that the medieval Latins speak of a distinction between attributes with a remote foundation. This is evident from St. Basil's examples and explanation. Quote, for instance, when he calls himself the light of the world, he points out the inaccessibility of the glory and the divinity. He also calls himself this because he illuminates those who have purified the eye of their soul with the splendor of his knowledge. He calls himself vine because he nurtures those who have been planted in him by faith, so that they may bear the fruits of good works, and bread because he turns out to be the rational being's most appropriate nourishment. And if anyone should examine each of the names one by one, he would find the various conceptualizations, even though for all there is one substance as far as substance is concerned. End quote. This last part is obviously incompatible with a real distinction between essence and energies. He believes that we name God with different names according to his different effects, but it is one single, simple substance that he names. For these are not synonymous or polynyms, because they name the one God under two aspects. He goes on to explain this, quote, we say that the God of the universe is incorruptible and unbegotten, designating him with these names according to various aspects, end quote. This is exactly how St. Thomas answers objections given to divine simplicity dozens if not hundreds of times throughout his corpus. In summary, St. Basil's refutation of Eunomian establishes precisely the same doctrine as St. Thomas. God is absolutely simple in reality, but known through genuinely distinct concepts that have a foundation in bringing about different effects, which we call a remote foundation in reality. Critics often quote passages from these fathers that seem to contradict divine simplicity, but these apparent contradictions dissolve when we understand the philosophical distinctions the fathers are making while reading them in context. A classic example of this can be found in a passage that is quoted from St. Basil. Quote, but how is it not ridiculous to say that his creative power is his substance, or that his providence is his substance? In other words, how is it not ridiculous to regard every energy of his as his substance? End quote. Does this mean that he posits a real distinction between the essence and the energies? No, not at all. This passage actually comes right after all the preceding passages that we quoted. Very clearly, he is rejecting the Eunomian idea that all the names of God mean the exact same thing. That is, that they are synonyms or polynyms without any foundation in God. Otherwise, he would be speaking out of both sides of his mouth and contradicting himself. We can see this from his own explanation of the text. He goes on to write, quote, and if all these names converge upon a single meaning, each one has to signify the same thing as the others, such as is the case with polynyms. Each of the names is deprived of its proper signification, and conventions are established that contradict both common usage and the teaching of the Spirit. How is it not sheer madness to deny that a proper signification underlies each of the names, and to claim in contradiction to their actual meaning that all names mean the exact same thing as one another? End quote. How much clearer could St. Basil get? He denies that these converge on a single ratio. He denies that they are polynyms. Rather, he affirms that these have their own proper ratio. This is exactly the teaching of the Thomists on this point to the letter. Thus, when he speaks of such as not the same, he does not imply some sort of real distinction or composition in God. Rather, he simply implies a distinction in ratio, which is, of course, the Thomist position. Many may accuse me of imposing such distinctions on St. Basil, but it is clear from his own words that he is aware of such a distinction, and employs it positively in order to describe his own view. In one place he writes, quote, "On the one hand, there is a certain opposition, as they themselves affirm, between the unbegotten and the begotten according to the imposition of the words, even if not according to the nature of the realities. On the other hand, between light and light, no one can conceptualize either a verbal or a notional opposition." End quote. The notional is clearly between the verbal, on the one hand, that is, the position of the Eunomians, and, on the other hand, between the distinction of reality, which is, as he states in a number of places, only relationally present between the persons of the Trinity. This reaches its most powerful expression in arguing against composition in God, where St. Basil writes, quote, "Our response to the objection that God will be revealed as composite, unless the light is understood as the same thing as unbegotten, goes as follows. If we were to understand unbegottenness as part of the substance, there would be room for this argument, which claims that what is compounded from different things is composite. But if we were to posit, on the one hand, the light or the life or the good as the substance of God, claiming that the very thing which God is life as a whole, light as a whole, and goodness as a whole, while positing, on the other hand, that the life has unbegottenness as a concomitant, then how is the one who is simple in substance not incomposite? For surely the ways of indicating his distinctive feature will not violate the account of simplicity. Otherwise, all the things said about God will indicate to us that God is composite." End quote. What is this distinction between a name naming a part and a name naming the whole of God except to say with St. Thomas, following magisterial declarations from Priscas and popes and councils, that God is his own light, his own life, and his own goodness? How can someone holding to the real distinction of essence and attributes or energies say that the very thing which God is life as a whole, light as a whole, and good as a whole? In summary, when read in context, St. Basil's seemingly contradictory statements actually affirm the strongest possible doctrine of divine simplicity. God is each of his attributes wholly and completely, not as parts, but as the whole divine essence under different aspects. Beyond what was said above, both the Cappadocians and St. Thomas make a crucial distinction between knowing that God exists and knowing what his essence is. This distinction is often misunderstood by critics, who claim that the Fathers deny we can know God's essence in any way. St. Basil brings forward a distinction between knowing of what and knowing of that, which draws its origins from Aristotle and is similarly reflected in St. Thomas. St. Basil confesses, quote, "I do know that he exists. What his essence is, I look at as beyond intelligence." End quote. This is stated in his famous Letter 234. This is something constantly on the lips of St. Thomas. For example, when he writes, quote, "We are able to grasp not what God is, but what he is not, and the relations of other things to him." End quote. In this epistle, St. Basil explains this distinction more fully. Quote, "We say that we know the greatness of God, his power, his wisdom, his goodness, his providence over us, and the justness of his judgment, but not his very essence. For he who denies that he knows the essence does not confess himself to be ignorant of God, because our idea of God is gathered from all the attributes which I have enumerated." End quote. Is this not exactly what St. Thomas says, and does this not line up with what was said before? St. Thomas states the exact same principle. Quote, "We cannot know the essence of God in this life, as he really is in himself, but we know him accordingly as he is represented in the perfections of creatures, and thus the names imposed by us signify him in that manner only." End quote. Further, he writes, quote, "Our intellect cannot know the essence of God itself in this life, as it is in itself. But whatever mode it applies in determining what it understands about God, it falls short of the mode of what God is in himself." End quote. Now, as we saw before, St. Basil affirms that it is only from the energies of God that we know the attribute, that is, only from his effects. This was already clearly explained from Book 1 of Against Eunomius. Here he writes, quote, "If they say that essence is something distinct, let them not put us in the wrong on the score of simplicity. For they confess themselves that there is a distinction between the essence and each one of the attributes enumerated. The operations are various, and the essence simple. But we say that we know our God from his operations, but do not undertake to approach near to his essence. His operations come down to us, but his essence remains beyond our reach." End quote. St. Basil clarifies what he means by energies or operations through the example of Christ's disciples. Quote, "When did the disciples worship him? Was it not when they saw creation subject to him? It was from the obedience of sea and winds to him that they recognized his Godhead. Therefore the knowledge comes from the operations, and the worship from the knowledge. We know God from his power. We therefore believe in him who is known, and we worship him who is believed in." End quote. Isn't this exactly what we read St. Thomas say above? That we know the attributes of God from his effects? Thus St. Thomas writes, quote, "We know that this proposition which we form about God, when we say that God is true, and this we know from his effects." End quote. Is this not word for word what was said by St. Basil, that we know that God is from his effects? Further, in another place, St. Thomas writes, quote, "Because therefore God is not known to us in his nature, but is made known to us from his operations or effects, we name him from these." End quote. Yet it is not appropriate to stop here. Many Orthodox will quote Epistle 234, but refuse to read Epistle 235. In Epistle 235, St. Basil actually expands on what was said. Here he even more clearly shows that he does not contradict the teachings of St. Thomas. He writes, quote, "In our belief about God, first comes the idea that God is. This we gather from his works. For as we perceive his wisdom, his goodness, and all his invisible things from the creation of the world, so we know him. So too we accept him as our Lord. For since God is the creator of the whole world, and we are a part of the world, God is our creator. This knowledge is followed by faith, and this faith by worship." End quote. Here it is clear that the energies that are mentioned are simply God as his perfections are reflected in his effects, not some special, really distinct attribute of God. In summary, the distinction between essence and energies in the Fathers is not a real distinction in God, but a distinction between God as he is in himself, unknowable in this life, and God is known through his effects in creation, exactly the teaching of St. Thomas. Another line of attack of these critics is to point to the Beatific vision. They often claim that the Fathers deny we can ever know God's essence, but this misunderstands their distinction between knowledge in this life versus the Beatific vision, and between knowing God's essence versus comprehending it. These distinctions are also explicitly made by St. Thomas. The objectors point to certain Fathers who say that we do not know the essence of God, and then accuse St. Thomas on this point. Unfortunately, as is frequently the case, these individuals have not done their homework. As we have seen time and time again, it is denied that we see the essence of God in this world because we walk by faith and not by sight, as is repeated by both St. Basil and St. Thomas. It is in this sense that many of the Fathers who are quoted are to be taken, that is, in talking about the knowledge we have of God in this world. Yet St. Thomas affirms that in the next life we will see God as he is in the Beatific vision, which is certainly not denied by the Fathers cited. To the contrary, this very distinction is present in their writings. Thus, for example, St. John Chrysostom states, quote, "How shall he who knows the essence be ignorant of the dispensations? Since that knowledge is greater than this, that he is we know, but what he is, as regards his essence, we know not yet." End quote. But some are quick to point to other texts, where there is a universal denial of any possibility of knowledge of the essence. Yet we need to make a second distinction, one which is present in both the writings of the Fathers and in the writings of St. Thomas, between comprehensive and non-comprehensive knowledge. For example, I'm sure you've heard this quote from St. John Chrysostom before. Quote, "What then, are we all in ignorance? God forbid, but none knoweth him as the Son knoweth him. As then many have seen him in the mode of vision permitted to him, but no one has beheld his essence. So many of us know God, but what his substance can be, none knoweth, save only he that was begotten of him." End quote. Isn't this a refutation of the Beatific vision? Well, unfortunately, the Orthodox who quote this did not decide to read the next sentence. He goes on to say, quote, "For by knowledge he here means an exact idea and comprehension, such as the Father hath of the Son." End quote. This denial of an exact idea and comprehension in the Beatific vision is likewise stated by St. Thomas himself, who wrote, quote, "It is impossible for any created intellect to comprehend God, yet for the mind to attain to God in some degree is great beatitude, as Augustine says." End quote. In summary, the Fathers distinguish between knowing God's essence, which we will do in heaven, and comprehending it, which only God can do, exactly as St. Thomas teaches. Further, they also distinguished between the lack of knowledge of the essence in this life and the knowledge of essence we will have in heaven. Their denials refer to the comprehensive knowledge or knowledge in this life, not to the beatific vision. This is clear from a careful and systematic reading of their works. Yet there is a father who is even more clear than St. Basil on the issue of divine simplicity, that is, St. Gregory Nazianzus. St. Gregory wrote a work with the same title as St. Basil, Against Eunomian, which is meant to be an explanation and defense of St. Basil's theology. Here St. Gregory Nazianzus provides perhaps the clearest patristic affirmation that divine simplicity means God's attributes are distinguished in a manner that is perfectly coherent with Catholic dogma. In the third theological oration, we see a text that critics love to quote. Quote, "Are immorality and innocence and immutability also the essence of God? If so, God has many essences and not one, or deity is a compound of these. For he cannot be all these without composition, if they be essences." End quote. Does this mean that there is a real distinction in God? No, of course not. The quote itself disproves it. For to be a compound of multiple attributes is to have a number of really distinct things united in a whole. Gregory is denying composition, not affirming a real distinction. Does this mean that the attributes are mere polynyms? No, St. Gregory refutes this in section 12 of the same oration, explicitly saying that they are not polynyms due to the fact that they are not absolutely identical. What is the sense in which they are not identical? He explains himself saying, quote, "As in the case of a horse or an ox, or a man of the same definition, applies to all the individuals of the same species, and whatever shares the definition also has the right to the name. So in the very same way, there is one essence of God, one nature, and one name, although in accordance with a distinction in our thoughts, we use distinct names, and that whatever is properly called by this name really is God, and what he is in nature, and what he is in nature, that he is truly called. If at least we are to hold that truth is a matter not of names but of realities." End quote. Here's an almost identical presentation of divine simplicity to that of St. Thomas. The distinction is in our thoughts, not in God's reality. St. Thomas says the same thing. Quote, "Our intellect, since it is insufficient to grasp the divine essence itself, rises to its knowledge from created things that are with us. However, we can't name something unless we understand it, since names are signs of intellects. We cannot name God except from perfections found in such reality. And since these perfections in these things are multiple, it was necessary to impose many names on God, by which we would manifest the diverse conceptions that our intellect conceives about God, which in God are one." End quote. Yet it is not until his Against Eunomian that St. Gregory provides the most philosophically developed defense of how multiple names can apply to a simple God, without implying either real distinction or mere verbal difference. As mentioned above, St. Gregory's Against Eunomian functions as a defense of the teaching of St. Basil's Against Eunomian. In the second book, St. Gregory expands upon what was said by St. Basil about conceptualization, and the anti-Neopalamite sense of the term comes into full clarity. He begins by establishing that our names for God are human inventions that come after God's existence, in order to refute the Eunomian position on the matter. Quote, "Our assertion is that the names of existing things are invented for existing things by the human mind, and he himself concedes that those who use words are demonstrably later than the divine life, and that the divine nature exists as it exists now and always existed, unbegotten. If therefore he himself concedes that the blessed life precedes mankind, and we do not dispute that it was later in time that men came into existence, and if we say that we have used words and names from the moment we were created, and received from our Maker articulate speech, and if unbegottenness is a word denoting a particular idea, and every word is a part of human speech, then one who concedes that the divine nature exists before mankind must agree that the title invented for that nature is of later origin." End quote. This is crucial. The names don't exist independently in God, but are our ways of understanding him. St. Gregory then explains why we need multiple names. Quote, "Everything whatsoever that may be thought about God existed before the world was Quote, "Everything whatsoever that may be thought about God existed before the world was constituted, but we assert that he is named after the one who names him was made. If the purpose of using names is that we should receive information from them about real things, and it is only ignorance that requires one to give information, and the divine nature, because it is all-encompassing, is superior to all information, that proves that it is not for God's sake, but for ours, the names are applied to describe him who is." End quote. This section contains the entire thesis of the scholastics. It states two things central to our account. First, that the divine names do not exist independently of the mind, and thus by definition are not really distinct. And second, that the reason for the multiplicity of the names has to do with the weakness of our intellects. St. Gregory continues with a powerful explanation of why God does not need our names. Quote, "He who knows all things, and himself before all things, needs no syllables and words to learn what are his nature and rank. It is rather in order that we may ourselves get some understanding of what may be devoutly thought about him, that we have labeled our various thoughts with words and syllables, stamping verbal shapes as signs and markers on our mental processes, as to get clear and distinct pointers to our psychic processes by the sounds we attach to the ideas." End quote. This confirms the Thomistic argument. The names and their multiplicity are products of our reasoning, of our psychological process, rather than something independent of our psychological process. He continues this same line, quote, "If, however, his existence before both word and thought is universally agreed, and if the giving of the name, by which our understanding is stated, is held to be invented by our conceiving it, and if his object in his dispute with us is to show that the title is not just conceived by human beings, but that it exists even before our creation, I do not understand what it is said about, and what it has to do with his set purpose of saying that God exists unbegotten before there are beings. That God exists unbegotten before there are beings, and his struggle to affirm that a concept is a later existent than God." End quote. How could he, on the Dyerite assumption, even say these things? It makes no sense whatsoever. In fact, so far from his conception of divine simplicity, St. Gregory refutes the objections of the Eunomians, which sound very much like arguments used to attempt to refute the virtual distinction, writing, quote, "Once it was conclusively proved that the name is totally distinct from any meaning connected with being, he deliberately makes a muddle of what is being said, shifting the battle from the word to the things, so that he can easily knock down the unwary by this sort of muddle. If they think we have said that God is either a concept or secondary to the invention of words by men, and that is why he leaves our position unrefuted and shifts the battle to other ground." End quote. Thus, where are the origins of these terms to be found? He says that they follow upon the nature as imperfectly conceived in the process of conceptualization, writing, quote, "Our position was, as we have said, that the word unbegottenness does not denote the nature, but attaches to the nature by being conceived, and that by it his existence without prior cause is indicated. The position they argued was that the word denotes the being itself. Where then are the arguments that such is the meaning of the title?" End quote. It is precisely the scholastic position that the multiplicity of names arises out of our multiplicity of concepts, that is, of the nature as conceived. In reply to this, Eunomius seems to have predated the Dyerites in their equation between the distinction which is nominal and rational, mocking it, which St. Gregory utterly and completely refutes, writing, quote, "By these means he ridicules the word concept, and proves it is useless and of no benefit to anyone. So where do we get the higher studies from? Where do we get the sciences of geometry and arithmetic, the very philosophy of being itself, metaphysical speculation? Was it not through conceptual thought that all these discoveries are made for mankind? As I see it, mental conception is the way we find out things we do not know." End quote. Besides Book 2 of Against Eunomius, there are various other clear statements from other parts of his work. For example, in Book 1, one of the arguments he gives against Eunomius for the impossibility of various grades of deity, as Eunomius had posited, has to do with the identity between the goodness of God and his nature. He writes, quote, "Nothing which possesses wisdom or power or any other good, not as an external gift, but rooted in its nature, can suffer diminution in it, so that if anyone says that he detects beings greater and smaller in the divine nature, he is unconsciously establishing a composite and heterogeneous deity, and thinking of the subject as one thing, and the quality to share in which constitutes as good that which was not so before as another. If he had been thinking of a being really simple and absolutely one, identical with goodness rather than possessing it, he would not be able to count a greater and a less in it at all." End quote. Just as St. Basil had done, so also does St. Gregory state that the attributes are really identical with the divine being. This is similarly applied in relation to the Holy Spirit against the Macedonians, where he writes, quote, "If then there is but one simple and single definition of his being, the good which he possesses is not an acquired good, but whatever he may be beside. He is himself goodness and wisdom and power and sanctification and righteousness and everlastingness and imperishability, and every name that is lofty and elevating above all other names." End quote. St. Gregory of Nyssa demonstrates that the multiplicity of divine names arises from our mode of understanding, not from any real distinction in God, who is each of his perfections wholly and simply. In conclusion, the evidence presented here demonstrates conclusively that St. Basil, both St. Gregory's, and St. Thomas Aquinas are all teaching the same doctrine of divine simplicity. They use the same philosophical framework derived from Aristotle and Porphyry, employ the same technical distinctions between polynyms and distinct rationes, and arrive at the same conclusion. God is absolutely simple in his being, and the multiplicity we perceive exists only in our concepts, which have real foundation in God's perfection, but do not imply any real distinction or composition in him. The supposed contradictions between East and West on divine simplicity arise not from the texts themselves, but from superficial reading, quote mining, and a failure to understand the philosophical background that both the Fathers and the Scholastics shared. When we do the hard work of understanding these texts in their proper context, with their proper philosophical background, we find not division but remarkable unity in the Church's theological tradition. The Church Fathers and St. Thomas Aquinas aren't opponents in this debate, they're allies, using the same philosophical tools to defend the same fundamental truth. God is absolutely simple, without composition, and the multiplicity we perceive is in our concepts, not in his essence.